are in Daf Pei Gimel Amud Beis 83b, and in the Mishnah it said that not only the leftovers of the meat, but also the bones and the gidin, which are essentially sinews, which could be nerves, it could be tendons. Those would be also need to be burned as leftovers. And Friday we dealt with the question of why would the bones be considered leftovers? The bones are not meant to be eaten. So let's talk about the marrow in the bones, but you can't break the bones. And so how do you get the marrow? And so we had a whole discussion about the bones and the marrow being edible and that, whether that needs to be burned. Now we're going to address the gidin, the sinews, which are essentially tendons and tendons and nerves. So the Gemara says, Hani gidi, these sinews, and this is 8 lines from the top, Pei Gimel Amud Beis 83b. Hani gidin, these sinews. Heichidami. What are we talking about? What kind of sinews? Gidi basar. Are they like meat, meaning they're edible? They're a part of the muscle, like tendons and so on. So let him eat it. Why would he be leaving it over? And if it was left over, so that's already listed because the Mishnah says bones, sinews, and nosar. Nosar meaning leftover meat. If it's just edible sinews, so that's just leftovers. So why does it have to be mentioned separately? El pshita giditzav. So must be it's talking about the nerves that are in the neck, and they're not edible. They're actually very hard. They're almost like wood-like. Now, if you tell me they're like meat, so that's why it needs to be burnt, because they're somewhat like meat, and enough that if you ate it, you'd fulfill the mitzvah, even though you don't have to eat it. We'll see later that certain parts that are that don't have to be eaten, and you can't really count it as a part of the animal that you're going to be eating because it's not edible. If you say that this part is edible, so it needs to be burnt because it's edible, and somebody, if they would eat it, they would fulfill the mitzvah, but you can ignore it because it's really not so good to be eating and to be eaten, and therefore that's why you would burn it, right? But if you say these sinews in the neck, these gidin in the neck, don't count as meat, so why does he have to burn it? So he says, actually, we're not talking about that. You're right that may not be considered edible, or it is considered edible. Either way, whatever is edible is considered meat, and that's included in Isar. What's not edible is not considered meat. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the Gid Hanosha. We know that after Yaakov wrangled with the Malach, he made him limp, and account of that limping, he moved his Gid Hanosha, which is his sciatic nerve, and by having pinched it or sort of moved the sciatic nerve, and he had that pain, and he was limping, and so therefore we don't eat the sciatic nerve. And this is according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. The Tani we learned, Rabbi Yehuda says that that this Gid Hanosha, the prohibition of eating the nerve, it's only in one of the two thighs, in 2 legs. So at the back of the animal, from the spine, there's 3 nerves coming out that conjoin into one, and it's both on the right side and on the left side. Rabbi Yehuda says that nerve that goes on either side, only one of them is going to be prohibited. And which one is it? It's the one on the right. The one in the left leg is not going to be prohibited. How does he know that? He says, "V'hadas machras shal yamin," and the intention seems to be weighted that it's the right one. Now the Gemara over there has a question. Does Rabbi Yehuda mean he's not sure whether it's the right one or the left one? He knows it's only one, but he's not sure which one it is, and it seems to be probably that it's the right one. Or does he mean no? The Torah really intended the right one because it said the, and the would be the right one. so so over here, since in Rabbi Yehuda, there's only one that's permissible and one is prohibited, and so therefore the question is which one it is. So you can't eat either, but one of them is prohibited and one of them is permitted. And the one that's permitted is really meat that you have left over that you should have eaten. And that's what the Mishnah is saying, that this gid hanasha, which is prohibited, but you don't know which one it is. So therefore, one is permitted, one is prohibited, and the permitted one is leftovers because you should have eaten it. Of course, you shouldn't have eaten it because maybe it's prohibited, but you should have eaten it in as much as that it was permitted, and it's a part of the Korban Pesach. And since you didn't eat it, that's what the Mishnah means, that the gid, the sinew, must be burnt. So the Gemara says, okay, so now you can prove from our conversation that Rabbi Yehuda was unsure which one is permitted and which one is prohibited. The Rabbi Yehuda, because the mifshit shitale, because if he was sure that it's the right one, he should have actually eaten the left one, which is permissible. Now the Yisur and Nashadi and only tossed the one that's prohibited. And therefore, why would he have to burn it? No, what it means is that he knew that the right one is permissible and the left is prohibited and the left one's permissible. However, it got mixed up and he doesn't know which is which at this point. And that's why he had to toss both of the sinews, both of the sciatic nerves, and that's what was prohibited. And that's why, on doubt, it was prohibited, but it was one of them was permissible from a Torah perspective, from a Torah level, meaning originally it was permitted, and then because of doubt he couldn't eat it, and that's why he had to burn it because it was an edible piece that was left over. Ravashi said it's talking about the shumna shagid anasha, the fats around the gid. That even though that the Torah only prohibited the sciatic nerve, but there are some fats around the nerve, and that Bnei Yisrael have accepted upon themselves not to eat. So that's, even though that it's permissible from a Torah perspective, we've accepted not to eat it, and it's a rabbinic prohibition at this point. And so that needs to be burnt because it's leftovers of an edible part of the Korban Pesach. The Tanya, as we learned, Shamnei muter, even though that the fats of the sciatic nerve are permissible, the Gid HaNasha, that's permissible. Yisrael the Jews, Am Yisrael, are holy and accepted upon themselves to treat it as prohibited, and that would therefore be edible on a Torah level, edible food that was left over and needs to be burnt. Ravina it could be Yehuda Mashmul, and it's talking about the outer one. So the way the sciatic nerves works, the two nerves actually come from the spine. There's the sciatic nerve that comes along the outer side, the back side of the femur and the bones, and go all the way down, and it splits into two and comes down in the front of the lower bone and the back. And then right in front of it, there's a femoral nerve, which is another nerve that comes from the outer side of the thigh and wraps around onto the inner side of the thigh. And that is not the sciatic nerve that is prohibited. It's a separate nerve. It's a separate nerve, which is the femoral nerve. But nevertheless, this nerve rabbinically is prohibited. It's called the gid hachitzon, the outer one, because it's closer to the outer side of the animal towards the front of the leg. In any case, so that one, being that it's rabbinically prohibited, we wouldn't eat it, but it's on a Torah level permissible, so that needs to be burnt as leftover meat. Like Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Beis Gid and Haim, there are two sinews, two nerves in the thigh. The inner one, meaning the one that's is sort of between the two legs, it's behind the bone, close to the bone, asr. That's a Torah prohibition, and therefore chayav and olav. There's also somebody that eats it would be held responsible for it. And chitzon, the outer one, which is more towards the front of the animal, and the outer side towards the outer side of the animal, to the right side of the animal, hasamach lebasar, close to the meat. That's talking about it's near the bicep muscle. Gid HaNashe, the sciatic nerve, is more by the quadricep, and this is by the bicep muscle. And Usser, that is prohibited, but it's rabbinically prohibited, vein chayav and alav, and therefore is not held responsible. So again, the concept here is that which is really edible, but prohibited for a secondary reason, meaning a rabbinic prohibition, or because of the fats, or because it got confused with the prohibited one, and so therefore you couldn't eat it. So you have to burn it because it's even though that it was prohibited, that a prohibition that didn't allow you to eat it, nevertheless, it's going to count as food that was edible that you didn't eat, and you have to burn it the next day. Now, you don't burn it on Shabbos, and you don't burn it on Yontif itself either. When do you burn it? On Chol Hamoed. Why didn't you burn it the morning of Yontif? So the Gemara asks, why can't you burn it on Yontif itself? Naisi aseh. Let's say that the Torah positive commandment, which is to burn the leftover meat, and that will supersede the prohibition of making a fire on Yontif, not for cooking, not for a Yontif meat. As we know, a general rule that asay de chalisase, when you have the contradiction in front of you. I mean, when you have a positive commandment and a negative commandment sort of come before you at the same time, and you have a mitzvah to do, but the only way to do it is going to be a prohibition, that generally we say, if it's a single positive commandment and a single negative commandment, the positive commandment supersedes, as we've seen from the Ramban and from others. The idea is because the positive commandment represents the love of Hashem, and that supersedes the negative commandment, which is a fear of breaking the rules. In any case, so the positive commandment over here of burning the leftovers should supersede the prohibition of making a fire for nothing. So why can't you burn it on Yontif? Chizkiya said, and so too was there a brisa in the Academy of Chizkiya Makra. The Torah says, it says, do not leave any over to the morning. And that which you left over to the morning, you will burn it in fire. Now, why did it say to the morning twice? It already said don't leave it to the morning. So all I had to say is, and that which you left over, you shall burn in fire. Why does it say again in the morning? It doesn't have to teach again to the morning. So why does it say ad boker again? To tell you that the burning is a different morning. It's a second morning from the morning of when it's left over. Don't leave it over to the morning, and that which is left over to the morning, to the next morning, that's when you're going to burn it. You can't burn it that morning itself because it's Yontif. Abaye says there's a different teaching. It says about the permission to bring a carbon on Yontif or on Shabbos. It says Oila Shabbos b'Shabbat. You will bring the ascent offering of Shabbos on Shabbos. But you can't bring a weekday Yontif on Shabbos. And also not a weekday offering on Yontif. And so from there we're going to see that you cannot do bring a carbon that's not today's carbon on Yontif. So for sure you can't burn an invalidated carbon from yesterday that became invalidated and now you have to burn it. You can't burn it on Yontif. You can't even bring a proper carbon today if it was from yesterday. Rava says we have another source. It says in the pasuk, it says in regards to food on Yontif that you're allowed to cook food on Yontif. You make a fire to cook food on Yontif. And there it says, this alone may you do on Yontif. Hu levado yasalchem. This alone. So what does it mean? Hu v'lo machshirah. This alone, this, but not prep work for that. You can't chop the wood in order to make a fire. Levado, this alone. Now we go to Pei Daled Amalaf. Alone, v'lo mila. This, but not a bris, shaleh b'zman, if it's not the correct time. Haba mikal v'chomer, which I would have thought there's a kal v'chomer that I could do it. And the kal v'chomer is based on that we know that you can do a bris, even if somebody has a tsaras, a leprosy on the foreskin, we would do the bris. Now, even though that technically speaking, you're not allowed to remove a tsaras, and yet that positive commandment of doing a bris will supersede the prohibition of removing a tsaras, and you do the bris, even though that's going to essentially remove this negat tsaras, the what we call leprosy, but it's a tsaras, it's this spiritual blemish, and so we see that bris milah is stronger than tsaras, and tsaras is stronger than the service of the in the Beis Hamikdash, and meaning that if somebody's obligated to do a service in the Beis Hamikdash and he has a tsaras, he can't do it. So we see that Shabbos is stronger. Bris is stronger than tsaras, and tsaras is stronger than the avodah. That means bris is stronger than the service. And if the service is stronger than Shabbos, Shabbos, so then for sure bris, which is stronger than bris milah, than tsaras, which is stronger than the service, which is stronger than Shabbos. So bris for sure, even not in its proper time, should supersede Shabbos. Nevertheless, we have a special pasuk to tell us, right? This alone and nothing else to tell you that you cannot do it if it's not in the proper time. Only a bris on the 8th day supersedes Shabbos. A bris that's not on the 8th day does not supersede Shabbos Yom. Ravashi Omar. Ravashi says, no, we have another pasuk. Omar, it says, Shabbason the Yontiv Asehu. So actually, we said you have a single positive commandment to burn the leftovers, and you have a single negative commandment, don't do work on Yontif. So the positive commandment supersedes the negative commandment. Actually, he says there's a positive commandment as well on Yontif, because the Torah says Shabbason. It's a resting. So that, he says, is a positive commandment to rest. And that positive commandment now means that you have both a positive and a negative commandment on Yontif. So one positive commandment cannot supersede a positive and negative commandment. And that's why you cannot burn it on that day. You burn it the next day on Chanukah. Now the Gemara is going to tell us, so in the lamb, as we saw before, that you can't leave any over. So all the leftovers have to be burnt, which means that you're not allowed to leave any over. What parts do you have to eat? And more than that, we know that you have to have a kazayas for every person that joins the group. What can you count as edible, and what can you not count as edible? So, and the Korban Pesach is a young goat or a young lamb. It's all in the first year of its life. So whatever is edible in a large bull, meaning after the bones had already hardened and after the cartilage has hardened and the muscles have hardened, everything is hardened already in a larger bull. At that point, that's what you look as what's edible and what's not. What's not edible in the larger animal, that's not going to count as edible for in the small lamb, even though that right now it's still soft, it's still cartilage and should be edible. And nevertheless, you cannot count somebody and say, "Oh, we have an extra olive size, a kazayas for you. You can join our seder because we'll give you this piece of cartilage." Then we say no. It doesn't count. And then it says v'roshek nafayim sachusim, and also the I think it's the head of the scapula and sachusim, some of the cartilage. So that's included. Now, what does that mean? So Rabbi asked the question. First, you say that which is edible in a large bull is edible, counts as edible in the young lamb or goat. Which I would assume is that whatever is not edible in a large bull is no longer considered edible in the lamb, and you can't count anybody as a carbon on that. But then look at the next line. But the cartilage is included. But in a large bull, you can't eat those. So it must be in the Mishnah itself. There are two opinions. This is what it means. Whatever is edible by a large bull is edible. You can count as edible in the young goat. And there are those that say and some say no. You can even count these parts, that these cartilage and so on, which if you cook the meat of the bull, even an old bull, you cook it a long time, it'll soften and it's edible. So that would count as edible for a young lamb and goat as well. However, Rava says no. Mahin Kitani. It's just explaining what's excluded. This is what it means. That which is edible when you cook a bull for a long time, that even just roasting the lamb is going to be enough, or a goat is going to be enough to since it's young, the roasting it is going to make it edible. And what would be included in that's edible? Rashi knafayim, vasachusim, these parts that are more cartilage, and when you cook it for a long time or you roast it in a lamb, it's going to be edible. Tanakh say the Rav, when we have a brisa like this, anything that's edible in the big bull when you cook it for a long time, it counts as edible in a young lamb or a young goat when roasting it. And what's included in that? Rashi knafayim, vasachusim. These cartilage, v'gidin arachin, and the soft sinews, nidanim kabasa, they all count as meat. Itmar gidin shasefel lahachshis. So it said that sinews that right now are soft and they're not hardened, but their tendons and so on, they're going to become they're going to harden at some point, and then it's not going to be edible. So Rabbi Yochanan says, right now it's soft. You can count somebody as eating that, an olive size of that, and it'll count as they can be part of your carbon Pesach. Reish Lakish says, no, it does not count. And this is one of the places that the halacha is like Reish Lakish. Now, Rabbi Yochanan says that we follow what it is now. And Reish Lakish says, no. We don't look at what it is now. We look at what it's going to be. And if it's going to harden, it doesn't count as meat. So Reish Lakish challenged Rabbi Yochanan. It says in our Mishnah, that which is edible in an older bull is edible in the young lamb and goat. And it says what's included in it. His cartilage. So only these, seemingly not sinews that are going to harden later in life. No, and just listed a few, but there's others as well. My timer. So, and the reasoning is my timer, hani my time. Why do you say that these cartilage is going to be included? Because if you cook the bull for a long time, it'll soften. So these two also, the sinews that harden would also soften and is edible in a large bull if you cook it for a long time. Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Avin. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Avin, Ki azlas hakamid Rabbi Abou. When you travel back to Eretz Yisrael, go ask Rabbi Abou, and Rami Le ask him, Go ask him if Rabbi Yochanan really said this, that the sinews that are hardened, that will harden later, are allowed to be counted as edible now, and somebody can join your carbon Pesach by joining to eat that one olive size of that. Because if that's true, because then it means that you follow what it is now and not what it's going to be in the future. And the reason that this is a question, because a young calf, the skin of the head, you could just pour boiling water on it, and it can be edible with the meat because it's still soft. And the question is, does it count as meat? Does that skin count as meat? Since there's a way when the calf is still young to make it edible, and does it count as a part of the meat? And do we say right now it's edible and therefore it counts as food? And we know that food is susceptible to tumah. Or do we say no, it's not really edible, and so it doesn't count as food, and it's not susceptible to tumah? So Reish Lakish asked Rabbi Yochanan this. And Rabbi Yochanan had said over there in regards to it counting as food and being susceptible to tumah food, Rabbi Yochanan said, no, we don't follow that. It's right now. It's not edible. And so even though now it's edible, it's not an edible type of thing. It doesn't count as food. So we see that it follows that he follows what's later, not what's now. So the Gemara says, "Amalei." So Rabbi Abo responded, "The Rama Lachaha, whoever asks you this question, lechash lekimche, is not careful with what kind of wheat he's grinding and making flour out of. In other words, he's not checking to see that the statements he has are accurate." Because indeed, the Rabbi Yochanan did indeed retract his opinion and on the basis of that teaching in regards to the skin of the head of a calf. And he said to Reish Lakish, "You're right. And I was mistaken because I had remembered a Mishnah, but that statement that I had remembered, because actually it was a single opinion, and that's what led me astray. That sinews that are going to later be hardened are going to be permissible. But I was mistaken. That's really a single opinion, and we follow the majority." And so Rabbi Yochanan himself ultimately retracted and joined the opinion of Rabbi Reish Lakish, who says that if the sinews, even though they're soft now, if they're ultimately going to harden and not be edible, right now it doesn't count as edible part of the Korban Pesach, and you can't have somebody join that your Korban Pesach for that part. The next Mishnah deals with something we brought up earlier in passing, the prohibition of breaking the bone of the Korban Pesach. The Torah says, "Ve'etzem l'sish b'rubon," and a bone you shall not break in it. So the Mishnah says, Pesach, somebody breaks the bone of a Korban Pesach. So hatahor, if it's a tahor, a spiritually pure Korban Pesach, so that's edible. So that's included in what the Torah said, boy, don't break in it. And therefore, he would get lashes, 40 lashes. In other words, he's held liable for breaking it. It's a Torah prohibition if he did so intentionally with witnesses, obviously. But the point is, you're not allowed to break the bone. But whoever leaves leftover, regardless of whether it's a kosher Korban Pesach or non-kosher Korban Pesach, if you leave any over, or if you break a bone in a Korban Pesach that's already tummy, even though you shouldn't do it, but you will not be held liable for doing it. Now, Gemara says, so the leaving over of a kosher Korban, we understand why that wouldn't be included. Netanya, as we learned, the Torah says, do not leave over until the morning. And what you did leave over, the next morning you're going to burn it. Now, from the fact that the Torah said, don't leave it over, that's a Torah prohibition. But then the Torah said, and what you did leave over, you're going to burn. So the Torah gives you a positive commandment after it gave you the negative commandment to tell us a general rule, to tell us this idea that when you have a leftover, if you have something left over, you burn it. So that means that when the Torah gave you the prohibition has a nitek la'aseh. It now has a fix to that transgression of the prohibition. Loimar she'ein loika. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda says, from here I learned that there is no lashes for that. However, Rabbi Yaakov says, no, that's not the correct reasoning for this. Rather, the reason is because it's a passive transgression. When the Torah says don't leave any over, that means if you just sit back and relax and let the time pass, you will transgress. That's a passive transgression. That passive transgression, and look in the love, you don't get lashes, or you don't get the punishment for the transgression unless you actually actively transgress, and the witnesses are there and they tell you don't do it, and you say I'm going to do it anyhow, and you do it. But if you didn't, if you passively passed it, there's going to be no transgression, no lashes. However, so we understand why leaving over, even though that you shouldn't. If you did, you're not held liable for it. But why are you not held liable for breaking the bone in a carbon pesach that's already tummy? Minolans, how do we know this? The Amakra, it says in the pasuk, boy, don't break a bone in it. What does it mean in it? Boy, be kosher. In it, if it's kosher. V'lei bepasul, not if it's already invalid. So the Brisa taught don't break a bone in it meaning it's a kosher carbon pesach, and not if it's an invalid kosher carbon pesach. However, Rabbi Yehuda it says in the Torah, you shall eat the carbon pesach in one house, meaning the one group all together. Don't take any part out of the house, and don't break a bone. So from the fact that the Torah by Mitzrayim said this mitzvah of eating the carbon pesach in one house and not taking it out, and also not breaking a bone, so we see that that which you can eat in one house, which you can eat, it's kosher to eat. There's a prohibition of breaking the bone. But if you're not able to eat it, meaning it's already a invalid carbon because it became tummy, so then there's no prohibition of breaking the bone. So there are multiple reasons given here as the source of how we know that there's no prohibition of breaking the bone if the carbon is already invalid. So so what's the distinction between these two interpretations? So one reason said, look, it's invalid. The Torah said in a kosher carbon, but not in an invalid carbon. The other said, no, it's not based on whether it's kosher or not. It's based on whether you can eat it or not. So what distinction is there? This, that we know that if the whole community is tameh, so then you bring a carbon pesach batuma. So it is invalid. It's still an invalid type of carbon. It's tameh. However, you're allowed to eat it. So Lamanda Amar Kosher, the one that says that it has to be a kosher carbon. So now we go to pay Dalet Amud base. So this is actually not a kosher carbon, right? High puzzle. So you're allowed to break the bone. But the one who says it has to be based on whether or not it's edible, this is edible, so you're not allowed to break the bone. Rav Yosef Amar, so Rav Yosef disagrees with Rabbi Yirmiyah, who says that it's based on whether you can any bone you can break the breaking a bone of a carbon pesach if it's based on whether it's edible or not. Amar ki hai gavna de kuli almei b'mishum shvira setzim. He says a carbon pesach, which is going to be brought as a communal carbon in Tuma, there, even though you're allowed to eat the carbon pesach, everybody's going to agree that you can't, that there's no prohibition of breaking the bone. Mishum the Rebbe lakuli kasi. Rebbe is being more lenient. It's not clear what exactly this line would be, but the idea is that Rebbe is adding that not only a carbon pesach that's invalid, there's no prohibition of breaking the bone, but even a carbon pesach that's kosher, meaning that you're allowed to eat. There's a carbon, meaning he's adding. It has to be invalid, or even if it's valid, if you're not allowed to eat it. And this is invalid. So rather, the distinction is whether it was something that was kosher at some point, that at the moment that you spritz the blood, it was a kosher carbon. So therefore, you can't say that it's invalid. It was valid. However, it was not edible, right? So the one that says that it has to be kosher, right? But the one that says that it has to be edible, this is not actually edible, and that would be the distinction. Abaye says, actually, the Kuli Alma, that everybody would agree, Kolki Hai Gavna, that in such a manner that the carbon was invalidated after you spritz the blood, but now it's invalid and nobody can eat it. It doesn't count as valid, and it doesn't count as edible, because either way, you can't eat it, and it's not a valid carbon right now. So therefore, you're not allowed to break. You are allowed to break the bone because it's not a valid carbon, and you can't eat it. My time hashami is because right now it's an invalid carbon, and you also can't eat it. Rather, the question is, prior to the time of eating, is they're a prohibition of breaking the bone. The one that says Lamanda Amar kosher, the one that says that it's a kosher carbon, so you're not allowed to break the bone. Kosher. It's a kosher carbon, even though it's not the time to eat it yet, but it's a kosher carbon, so you're allowed to. Not allowed to break the bones. However, according to the second opinion, that said that the basis for the breaking of the prohibition of breaking the bone is based on whether or not it's the time of eating it, because it says eat it in the house and don't take it out and don't break the bone. So that means at the time of eating that you're going to eat it in the house, that's when you're not allowed to break the bone. It's not the proper time for eating it. So the Gemara asks, so we ask a question, a contradiction, according to Abaye, who said that earlier in the day, before the sun set, before the nighttime comes and you're allowed to eat the Korban Pesach, before that you're allowed to break the bone. Well, Rebbe says, Nimnin ala moyach shebe roish. You're allowed to join a Korban Pesach. Now, you say, can I join your Korban Pesach? And the guy says, look, most of the meat's all accounted for. The only part that's not accounted for is the brains, the brain in the head, the moyach shabarosh, and it says in the head because they have the marrow uses the same word as moach. The marrow and the brain use the same word moach. So it says the moach shabarosh, meaning the brain. So a person can join the Korban Pesach. I say, look, if that's all I'm going to be able to eat, I'd rather join your Korban Pesach, join your Seder, and be a part of that, even if it means eating, less desirable parts. We're fine. But you cannot join saying, look, I'll eat the marrow in the femur. So what's the reason you can join the moach shabarosh, the brain? Because you can scrape it out, you can get it out after it's cooked without breaking the bone. Right? But the femur, how are you going to get the marrow out without breaking the bone? Now, but if you're going to tell me that, there's no prohibition of breaking the bone earlier in the day, before nighttime comes and you're allowed to eat the Korban Pesach, you're allowed to break the bone. So there's a way to actually make the femur marrow edible. And this guy says, look, I have an idea. Let me join your Korban Pesach. And even though there's all the meat's already accounted for, I'll take a kazayas, I'll take an olive size of the marrow from the femur. And how are we going to get it? Before Yontif sets in, we'll break it. So let me join by breaking the femur before Yontif. And according to Abaye. Now, according to everyone else, obviously, no one holds like Abaye and says that you can break the bone earlier in the day. But you, Abaye, interpret it to say that you can earlier in the day. There's an opinion that you can break the bone. So great. So let him join the Korban Pesach that way. So Abaye says, well, I have a way to get to it, get to the marrow another way. Don't break the bone. Get a coal, let it sit on the bone until it burns all the way through, and they'll get it out. And then he'll join that way. Tanya, we learned, even though you're not allowed to break the bone, but you could actually burn your way through into the bone. So you see that burning is not considered actually a prohibition. So somebody burns the bones, or somebody cuts the sinews. That doesn't count as having transgressed the prohibition or breaking a bone. So either way, that's possible anyhow. So why don't we have him join the group by saying, "I'll eat the marrow of the femur," rather. Abaye says that even though that essentially there is a way to get to the marrow of the femur, and he should be able to join that way, but we're afraid that the when you try and burn it, the bone will actually crack elsewhere. So if it burns a hole through, so that's permissible. But you can't be sure that when you heat it to that degree that the bone won't actually crack. And if it does, you've transgressed breaking the bone. Rava says it's a different reason, because you're ruining kachim, you're ruining some carbon by putting a coal on it. Biyadayim, you're ruining it. The kamafsid le biyadayim, you're ruining kachim biyadayim. How so? Til machal nurim emayich today, because the fire, the coal that you're putting on there, if it's going to burn a hole through the bone, it may burn through the marrow as well, and that's edible. And now, obviously, if you just leave it there, it's not going to be edible anyhow. But that's passive. That's happening on its own. But you can't actively, with your hands, go ahead and ruin the carbon itself. So the Gemara says, so also, therefore, beforehand, on Erev Yontif, you can't do it either, because you may do it, you may come to do it on Yontif, so you can't cut through it. So Abai says, I'm right. Before Yontif, you're allowed to cut it and break the bone. So what are you going to tell me? If so, why didn't Rebbe allow somebody to join based on the marrow in the femur? The reason is because if you let him do it before Yontif, he may end up breaking it on Yontif itself, and that's a problem. Tomorrow morning we'll continue with Rav Papa's interpretation of what the distinction is between the two opinions of what the basis of the prohibition of breaking a bone, the lack of prohibition of breaking the bone in a non-kosher carbon, what that is.